Today's episode is brought to you by my newest resource for women's health professionals, the Practitioner's Guide to Optimizing Egg Quality. This comprehensive guide breaks down the 5 key steps to improving egg quality, along with the top 5 evidence-based supplements to support egg development, mitochondrial health, and implantation potential. Head over to fertilityfriday.com/egg-quality to grab your complimentary copy today. That's fertilityfriday.com/egg-quality. This is the Fertility Friday podcast, episode number 586. In today's episode, we are delving into toxins. This is a big topic that can feel very overwhelming. And I feel like in today's episode, we cover a lot of ground. We talk about the issue itself and the difference between personal responsibility, like what you can actually do to reduce your toxin exposure, but also what aspect of this is outside of your personal control, right? We don't have control over which corporations are pumping which pollutants into the air and into our water. So I think that one of the reasons that this topic can be overwhelming is when you look at the research and you look at all the data. I mean, there's a lot of data on the impact of toxins on health, and it can be a huge rabbit hole. It can be extremely overwhelming. And so the approach that I've always taken with clients is perfection. I don't think is a good goal is I'm going to be totally clean and free of toxins, because you can't be. You still have to breathe air and things like that. So there'll always be some level of toxin exposure in our modern world. But the approach that I've taken more so is education and reduction. Let's see what we can reduce. So before we jump in, let me share a little bit about my guest today. Today on the podcast, I'm joined by Lara Adler. She is an environmental health educator and science communicator with over 14 years experience helping health professionals and health-focused businesses understand the impact of environmental chemicals on chronic health conditions. Her work bridges established and emerging research with practical, accessible strategies to minimize toxic exposures and build resilience against environmental challenges. Combining environmental health education with business consulting, she has helped over 5,000 health professionals in more than 35 countries elevate their expertise, achieve better client outcomes, and become sought-after leaders in their growing field of environmental health. So without further ado, let's jump into today's conversation with Lara. And I'm excited to be here today with Lara Adler. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa, for having me.
Well, I am really excited to have you here because, as I was saying in our pre-chat, it had a huge conversation on toxins. To start by just asking you a little bit about
looking for, and I'm going to put an asterisk there because I came to realize a couple of years ago, I don't know if it was entirely on accident, thumbtack. So, I was a nerdy kid in high school who was reading books about animal agriculture, plant agriculture, and was just interested in mushroom growing and food workshops and all of this type of stuff. So I was very much interested in food and nutrition. And that was sort of my entry into conversations about health. And so I went to a health coaching program and began health coaching, people they didn't have any major health challenges. Most of them just wanted to lose weight. And most of them were able to do that just by making, some pretty simple basic lifestyle changes, getting better sleep, all those sort of fundamental basics. But then I had a couple of clients who did all those same things and nothing actually changed for them. And that was perplexing to me. And so I started digging into the literature around resistant weight loss. And that's what kind of cracked the door open for me. I was reading about obesogenic chemicals. These are chemicals that are known or suspected to alter our metabolism in ways that can lead to weight gain. And that no matter what people do, some people are just going to struggle more with their weight than somebody else. And that might answer some of those questions. And it was really fascinating to me. I lived in New York City at the time. So I had the New York Academy of Sciences in my backyard and Mount Sinai's Children's Environmental Health Center also. And it was on their mailing list and going to every one of their workshops and lectures and symposiums that I could, to just being a sponge for this information. And that really is what kind of kickstarted my obsession, if you will, healthy obsession with this topic. And so I really started to dig into the literature and get a lay of the land, so to speak, of like, what do we know? What don't we know? Where are there other questions? Where's there research happening? And once I had a pretty decent grasp of the landscape, I decided to turn around and start sharing that with my peers, because none of the health coach, nutritionists, et cetera, that I was talking to had this wasn't on anybody's radar yet. This was in 2010. This really was, yes, there were some people involved in pushing for change in chemical policy. And yes, we had decades of research, but it wasn't in the sort of cultural conversation like it is now. Yeah, so I started teaching in 2012, and I have been doing that nonstop ever since. And going back to that thumbtack, because I was the nerd in high school that was like vegetarian and like interested in food, everything, all of my like high school papers were on that topic. I remember doing a demonstration on how to make chocolate pudding with tofu in like it was so dumb, but whatever. I was like on the train. And so about, I want to say 7 or 8 years ago, I went back to my home where I grew up. And you know, when you go back to your room where you grew up and you find like little remnants of things that you never thought were important enough to take with you. So you just kind of left them in your room and your parents maybe didn't touch it. I found a box of index cards that was the bibliography of this paper that I wrote in high school. And this was when we did bibliographies on index cards because it was the 90s. And I randomly pulled out a card, and the quote on the card was something about people turning towards vegetarian diets in part to avoid exposure to environmental chemicals. And I was like, wait, what? This has been on my radar in some capacity since I was a teenager. Also, my father works in the nonstick coating industry. He's a consultant. He doesn't work with the chemicals, but these are the PFAS chemicals that are ubiquitous. So I've also kind of had that perspective as well. So yeah, I've been in this conversation for a very long time, and it's been really exciting to see how it's changed in that time span.
Mm-hmm. I feel like the last 10 to 15 years in the health space have been very interesting. It seemed to coincide with the advent of social media. And this whole shift in this concept, even of social conversation, which didn't exist in the 90s
Yeah.
at all.
Yeah. At all.
At all. It's hard for the millennials maybe to understand this, but there was none of that. And so it is really, I can remember when this was not on the forefront. So when you said that, I can really resonate with that. And now everybody's talking about it. So tell us a little bit about this whole concept of environmental toxins. So typically, I'm looking at things from the view of the menstrual cycle lens and how things affect the cycle and how toxin exposure could affect whether it's your periods, hormones, fertility, all of those things. But of course, it spans a very wide net. So maybe share a little bit of insight from your research over the years.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think what helps kind of frame the conversation is to zoom out and look at some of the big picture stuff to help people kind of better contextualize what are we talking about here. And this has changed a little bit. So 5, 6, 7 years ago, I used to say when people hear the phrase environmental chemical, they used to think, and many probably still do, of things like air pollution and polluted bodies of water and that kind of environmental toxin. Those chemicals, harmful chemicals that are in those places are absolutely classified as environmental toxins. But the conversation that I've been focused on, and that certainly a lot of people in the health space are focused on right now, are the exposures that we get in our daily lives just by like being a normal human being on Earth trying to have a job and go to the grocery store and get showered and dressed and have a house, right? Or a place to live. And so in the normal course of that, we are also exposed to a large number of chemicals, many of which are known or suspected to cause harm, to be bioactive, and that we are sort of microdosing these chemicals, if you will, like all day, every day. There has been an enormous body of evidence of published studies going back decades, examining the effect that these chemicals can have in our bodies. And so that's kind of the big bubble of what we're talking about in terms of environmental chemicals. We are all exposed. There is no place on the planet that doesn't have some exposures. Chemicals are measured in the human body. We have human biomonitoring studies, government-run projects in different countries around the world that are monitoring for chemicals, among other things, in the human population. And we have hundreds of chemicals in us. I don't say that to scare people. I just say that to frame the idea that chemicals that are in the stuff that we surround ourselves with aren't always bound to those things, and that they come out and that they get inside us. The presence of a chemical inside us does not automatically mean that harm is being caused. Many chemicals are benign, and we'll take them in and pee them out immediately. And I'll say everything is a chemical, right? So in this discourse around toxins, people like to position the word chemical, air quotes, as being like inherently bad. Like, it's a chemical. Well, everything is a chemical. Hormones are chemical. Estrogen is a chemical. Water is made of chemicals. And so it's important that I know it's a ridiculous thing to have to say, like, well, I have to say this, but I do have to say that because there are people that look at anybody who's talking about quote unquote toxins and making this sort of broad judgment that anybody who's talking about this is fear mongering. And that's a common thing on social media. And that's just patently false, right? One, yes, sure, everything is a chemical. And yes, some of those chemicals are harmful. And yes, some of those chemicals are even harmful at extremely low doses. We know this. Lead has no safe level of exposure. There's harm at every exposure level. So we're all exposed. We all have some degree of chemicals in us. Sometimes we know or think we know what some of those health outcomes are. Other things we're just learning. Microplastics are in all of us, and we don't actually know what the implications of that are. We're just starting to tease that out now, and it will probably be at least a decade before we have more good evidence that is, and I'm not going to use the word conclusively because that's really hard to do, and I can explain why if you want. But the reality is that we're all exposed. Environmental exposures have the capacity to affect every organ system, every tissue in the body. And so there is this great sort of push to know more about chemicals that surround us, that make up our lives, and to regulate them in a way that minimizes exposure or minimizes harm, because we do know that these exposures contribute to major chronic health issues across the board. And so that's sort of the reality of the conversation. Like, that's what we're dealing with. Some populations have more exposure than others. Some jobs have higher exposures than others. If you're a hairstylist or a nail tech, you have higher exposures than somebody who works in an office. Or you might have different exposures to someone who works in an office, maybe not higher or lower. Auto mechanics, firefighters, people in the airline industry, pilots, flight attendants, they all have different exposures. And then there's communities that have different exposures, low income communities, fence line communities, which are communities that live adjacent to or nearby things like industrial factories or toxic waste dumps or just a regular dump, that have disproportionate exposures. So there are lots of different layers to the conversation, but that is, in a large nutshell, what we're talking about in the context of environmental chemicals.
Mm-hmm. It's such a big topic. And what you said about, it's interesting. I feel like when you're obviously knee deep in this. And so I could relate when you said fear mongering. I mean, when I would talk about the birth control pill back in the day, like 10 years ago, people would come out the woodwork and saying, you're anti-feminist and you're trying to fear monger. And even if you just tell people what the actual research says about the side effects, you're fear mongering. And so there is a bit of a line there. I think with the toxin conversation, when you do get into the research about the different toxins, it is absolutely terrifying. I mean, those are some of the hardest sections that I've found to kind of write about, because you're wanting to share what the data has to say in a way that is accurate, but you don't want to create this fear in the reader. You want to you want to balance the reality of the situation.
Right.
And then one thing I also want to say about it is, so for example, like from the lens of menstrual health, when we start talking about toxins, as you just finished mentioning, they are literally everywhere. So from my perspective, when I teach about just some practical things you can do to reduce your toxin exposure, the key word in my mind, and so I'd love to hear your take on this, has always been to reduce. If your goal is to like get yourself clean and free of all toxins, that is impossible. Because and it's interesting what you said earlier, because I used to say something like this. I would say, okay, so let's say you do all of the things. Let's say you go and you only eat organic, and I'm putting air quotes, organic food. You buy the cleanest products, whatever, like you get the filters on your shower, you do all this stuff. Like you still have to go outside and breathe air. Like you still have to like leave your house. So
you have to drive a car, you have to wear clothes.
Like, what is the goal here?
Yeah, I think the conversation is probably one of the most important ones, because people have become so hyper obsessed and perfectionist about everything, and not just the toxins conversation. It's about food. Like, I sort of banished always never framing or language in my work. I used to say that when you know more, you learn more, you know, and you do better, all that stuff. But that framing of always never, that binary black and white, it's either all good or all bad, is really stressful for people. It adds so much unnecessary anxiety. And I have seen people in my own life that have sort of succumbed to that and say, well, I can't let my kid go to so-and-so, her best friend's house, because they have scented candles. That is not what we're aiming for. In the food world, this hyper perfection of only eating, again, air quotes, clean, has been dubbed orthorexia. It's not in the DSM-5, so it's not a clinical diagnosis, but people are actually trying to push for it because there's some overlap. It's an eating, again, not an official eating disorder, but it ticks a lot of the boxes of people just becoming so hyper obsessed, obsessive ingredient reading, and all of that stuff. And this is coming from somebody who encourages people to read labels, but to not become obsessive about it. The reality is, it is literally impossible to reach a place of zero toxic exposures. Polar bears in the Arctic have PFAS and flame retardants in their bodies, despite being thousands of miles away from where these chemicals are used. And that's because both of those chemicals or classes of chemicals are persistent. So they go up into the clouds, they fall down as rain, they travel in wind currents, and so they are all over the globe. And so it is a futile effort to try to get to zero. All it does is push people towards a inevitable failure, because they can't, and then they operate under that like threat of failure, when true, quote, success, again, air quotes, is impossible. So the goal is not 100% non-toxic, again, air quotes, living. It is just to do the best that we can to reduce exposure.
Did you know that you could listen to The Fifth Vital Sign for free with your 30-day trial of Audible? Head over to fertilityfriday.com/audible to listen now. That's fertilityfriday.com/audible.
So going back to your discussion about menstrual cycle and fertility and all of this, is when we're looking at studies of, say, couples in fertility clinics, and we're looking at the birth outcomes of people that have, say, high levels of phthalate exposure versus low levels, and that the higher levels have more poor outcomes or longer time to conception or whatever the outcome is. At the low end of the spectrum, it's not zero, it's just lower. And so we are not aiming for zero, we're just aiming for less. We're just aiming for less. And I say that talking through the lens of what's avoidable, because not everything is avoidable. And the solutions or the tools or products that we buy, all the things that we do to try to reduce our exposures, those are not equally accessible to all people. And that is an important conversation that's often left out, is that not everybody can do all the stuff. Not everybody can buy the organic food or buy a $200 water filter or do all of this stuff. And so that, I think, is a part of the conversation that's often left out in the discourse, especially online, when people are trying to condense whatever they're sharing into like a 90-second reel or a 2,200 character Instagram post. Like, there's not enough space for nuance in these small snippets. And this is a conversation that literally exists in this incredibly nuanced gray area. Everything, the answer to every question, I like to say, is it depends. The first response to any question is it depends.
Yeah. I mean, it's such tricky territory. And one of the interesting things about the fertility awareness charting field is that it does attract type A, really intense individuals. And I feel like I can say that because I'm one of them. Like I'm you. We are the same.
Yeah.
And so a lot of what I do in my client work and working with practitioners has been to kind of deconstruct that a little bit, to really get at what the goal is. For example, with cycle charting, the goal can't be to have a perfect cycle every single month, because you're not a robot. So you're good. Like sometimes you're going to have a rough night of sleep. Sometimes you're like, stuff's going to happen. So then the question I want to ask out of that is, I mean, we've got these two extremes. We've got the I want to get to net zero toxin. I'm going to I'm only going to eat organic, all the things. I'm going to do all the things perfectly, right? Like that unrealistic expectation versus the weight of this problem, actually thinking about how scary it is to be exposed to these toxins, learning about specific toxins that are really dangerous. And like getting to that, I feel like the other end of the spectrum would be the apathy of like, well, I can't control any of it. It's like in everything anyways, right? So like, where's the balance?
So I would actually reframe that, because the two ends of the spectrum, yes, to the end of the spectrum that you just described, where people are like hyper perfectionist, that end of the spectrum, unfortunately, is veering towards anti-science. These are folks that say sunscreen is toxic and it's sunscreen that gives you skin cancer, not the sun. That is just patently false. But they really truly believe that because they've fallen so deep in that like perfectionist space of it being a conversation of purity. So that's one end of the spectrum. The far other end of the spectrum are the cosmetic formulator influencers that are like, all chemicals are in skincare are totally safe, and anyone who says otherwise is fear mongering. Or the folks that say pesticides are totally safe, and anybody who says otherwise is totally fear mongering. So those are the two far ends of that conversation, and both of them are wrong. Right? The truth is in the middle. It is in that gray area. Some of the perspectives that might be happening on the side that is trying really hard to avoid all these exposures, but going to the extreme, there is some truth in what they say. And there is some truth in what the folks on the other end of the spectrum say. But it's not black or white. That binary reductionist approach on both ends really hurts this conversation around environmental toxicity. I think there's less and less people, there's still probably millions of them, but there are less and less people that are coming from the I don't really care, we're all going to die anyway perspective, because awareness about environmental chemicals is growing. 10 years ago, I would be like, yep, it's either you care too much or you don't care at all. But now people are aware of microplastics and PFAS and BPA, and maybe not everybody knows what these things are, but they know the terms. Maybe they've heard them on the news, they've seen them in the paper, or whatever. If anybody even reads papers anymore, I don't know. Everybody gets their news from TV and social media. I think, to my point, is that the people on the end of the spectrum that say like pesticides are totally safe, all chemicals in commerce are safe, everybody is fear mongering, they're doing that in reaction to this other extreme, right? So it's like they're overcorrecting in both directions. And the people on the side that are dismissive of anybody talking about harmful effects of chemicals are ignoring decades of high quality peer reviewed research on environmental exposures and health impacts. And one of the things that the folks at that end of the spectrum like to do is they require absolute proof in these harms from chemicals. And one, proofs don't exist in science, they exist in mathematics. There is only evidence in science, right? So we're not anybody who's like, prove it. To me, I'm like, well, you've already lost. Sorry, argument over. That's an intellectually dishonest approach. So one, they're coming from the prove it crowd. The other thing that we have to acknowledge is that with the exception of some pretty horrific historical examples, we do not test chemicals directly on people for ethical reasons. So we cannot have a RCT double-blind placebo trial on does this chemical cause this health problem. That is profoundly unethical. And so what happens in the field of environmental health is we look first at animal research. That is the model that we use. And we use that to determine the method of action. How do these chemicals have any effect? At what doses are these effects observed? And what is the mechanism? How is A leading to B? And we do that using animal models. And there are plenty of people who say, I'm not a mouse, I'm not a rat, those studies don't apply to humans. And my counter to that is, yeah, sure, absolutely. But we also know enough about the field of toxicology to say, like, well, this animal model fills in the gaps of that animal model, meaning like rats, for example, don't have the capacity to vomit. So that means that some exposures that they get in their digestive system, they get orally, might have a stronger effect on them because they're not able to expel it. So it lives longer in the system and it just sits in their bodies. This is why for rat poison, manufacturers of rat poison will put a chemical in there that induces vomiting so that people who may accidentally ingest it will be triggered to vomit. But it doesn't work on rats because rats don't vomit. So they will ingest the chemical and it will kill them. So there are rodenticides that do that. So anyway, with this animal model argument, people like to say, I'm not a rat. And I say, okay, but rats are also used to determine safety. So if you are going to rely on research on animals that determine safety, that same model has to be appropriate to also determine harm. You cannot have it both ways, right? And so we look at animal data, and then we turn to epidemiological data. This is observational studies on humans. And we say, do we see these same chemicals in human population? That's what those biomonitoring studies I mentioned earlier do. They track that. And they say, is it in people? And if so, on average, how much? And is there differences in different populations? Are children more exposed? Are women more exposed than men? Like lots of different variable factors. So we look at that epidemiological research, which is observational in nature. It's not intended to prove causation or to show causation. Yet there are people, again, on this end of the spectrum that are like, prove it, show me the studies, blah, 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 that demand such an incredibly high bar that we ethically cannot produce. And so we have imperfect data, but that data, epidemiological data, tells us so much. And if we can see the same types of effects in humans, whether that's a fertility outcome or a metabolic outcome or a cardiovascular outcome associated with these chemical exposures that we've already determined in animal models, then that is considered strong evidence. And that's what we have, but somehow that's not good enough for some people on this end of the spectrum. So it's a really complicated and nuanced topic. I don't even know what your original question was, where I went down on that rabbit trail.
Well, that's really helpful, though. I think that because there's this perspective about science that really irritates me, that it's infallible. And as someone who also spends a lot of time in research, when you're looking at different research papers, they are sometimes looking at an isolated, whether it's a chemical in this case or like an isolated nutrient, and it's looking at a specific situation that may have been created. Like sometimes that's the kind of study that you're looking at. Sometimes you're looking at observational data, but it's like, you don't always know what all the other potential contributing factors are, even though the researchers try to screen those out. And what I always say is that research is done by people. And so you can have a result where you're looking at a paper and like you are looking at the same data as the researchers, but your conclusion would have been different, or you would have highlighted a different aspect of the result, as opposed to, like, I've seen studies where the thing that is most interesting to me isn't even in the abstract.
Right.
Because they had a specific mindset, or they're of a specific opinion.
Right.
And if you are of the opinion that chemicals are largely safe and that X chemical doesn't have, because I've heard some of that stuff too, where it's like this chemical, like there's chemicals that are known to cause these problems, but there's people that will say that it's completely fine and whatever. If you're of the opinion that chemicals are just all safe, then when you read the same data that I read, you might actually provide a different explanation and a different interpretation. So it is important to understand how research is done. And I think you highlighted an excellent point, which is that this is not a situation where we could literally use that gold standard and test these things. We can you're going to give pregnant women this like toxin.
And so I'll give you an example of where we did do that recently, and a test did get approval through the ethics board. So I think this was in 2018. This was a very small study, so like less than 10 people. So not something that we can make broad assumptions on, but it was an important first step of this type of research. And so what researchers did is they said, we're going to give humans, these volunteers, the dose of BPA, bisphenol A exposure, that is equivalent to the maximum tolerated level that is already set by the EPA. So EPA says 50 micrograms per kilogram of body weight per day is the safe limit. That's the cutoff, like that's safe. And there's a large margin of safety that's baked into that figure. Usually it's 100 or 1,000 or a couple thousands fold. And we're going to just give them that. And they got approval from the ethics board because a federal agency has already deemed that level safe. And so they're like, well, let's test it directly and see what happens. And so they did. And what they found is that single dose of BPA at that maximum level, which certainly might be more than what we might get in an average day, that altered their body's insulin response in a way that would, if kind of left unchecked or continued, might lead to diabetes. And so, okay, yeah, it's a small study. Yes, we need to reproduce it, but it is like shining a flashlight into a dark cave of the unknowns and skimming across something and going, whoa, what's that? Let me go explore that doorway for a minute. And so that research is important because it can open doorways into more granular study. We do have a few of these examples. Most of the examples are quite terrible when we've tested chemicals on people, often almost exclusively without their consent. Lots of bad history there. And so we're operating in a degree of uncertainty. And for some people, that's unacceptable, that uncertainty. But to your comment about like science is a process. It's not a finished product. And so, yes, science is fallible, one, because it's done by people and people are fallible. This is where the peer review process is super helpful, because then you have lots of expert people who are combing through research to identify any flaws in their logic, in their data, in their whatever methodology, whatever. And so the peer review process is super important. And science is fallible because as we learn more, our positions may change. And people also can't handle that, right? They say, you can't change your mind. You told us this, and now you're telling us this. And that's just proof that you don't know what you're talking about, when in fact, that is just the process of scientific discovery.
Mm-hmm.
And so people have a really hard time swallowing that. And, you know, as scientists, they don't, I think, at least the folks that I've spoken to, they don't attach like personal value to their work. Meaning if we find an outcome or we don't find an outcome, it's neutral. Because that's the sort of, ideally, hopefully, that neutrality is part of the scientific process, is to not go in with I'm going to do a study to find this, to find X or Y. That is not how the scientific process works. You can go in with a hypothesis and test it. But good researchers know that the process is to prove themselves wrong. Like that's how you design a good study, is to what can I do to make sure that my hypothesis is rigorously tested?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm going to try to prove myself wrong.
See, I feel like that's the ideal. After reading so many different studies, I definitely feel like people are still people and they do go into
100%.
And it's so funny when you read a research paper where the researcher finds something that they didn't anticipate finding. Because sometimes like the mental gymnastics or like the actual physical written gymnastics that they kind of like the word vomit around the thing that they found that they didn't think. It's entertainment. I mean, maybe this is not the kind of entertainment that people are used to, but like I find that stuff to be just really interesting and I feel like people need to know that. And I think that we've gotten to a place where I think that it's good. I think that requiring and requesting evidence to support your points, I do think that overall it's positive because it does prevent just general nonsense all the time.
Oh, absolutely. I'm a huge fan of citing research. Good research.
Yes.
Yeah.
But with that said, the problem is that there's always going to be people that are doing things more or less close to the ideal, as you described.
Of course.
And so you can also find a paper to support anything you want. There's at least one paper out there that is contrary to this or whatever. There's always, if you're looking at any topic, and you look at multiple papers on any topic, there's going to be papers that show a positive result and a negative result. You would have to have the wherewithal, patience, understanding to look at those research studies critically, look at the way that they conducted it to try to have a better understanding as to why maybe this study found this result versus this study and all of that. So at the end of the day, there's never going to just be this easy, like, this is the pinnacle study. We never have to do any more research ever again. We found the answer. And so it is a process, as you say. And something that
I'll just interject. This is where like consensus statements come in and say like, let's look at meta-analyses. Let's look at these systematic reviews that are looking at a lot of different papers and pooling the data and then analyzing it and saying, are we still seeing these trends? And are the quality of the studies that are, if it's garbage in, it's going to be garbage out, right? The quality of the studies in any given meta-analysis or systematic review has to be quality. But if we look at bodies, even like the American Gynecologists and Obstetricians or that ACOG has put out a long time ago position statements for clinicians to advise their patients in lowering exposures to, say, endocrine disrupting chemicals. They're not going to do that if they don't think that there's a strong enough body of evidence to support making that recommendation. And so when we have large bodies like ACOG, like the Endocrine Society, the NIH has a whole division, NIEHS, the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, that is devoted to exploring this. And they also have these position statements. And it's not again, it's like there's this bar of like absolute certainty. And like we exist in a place of uncertainty and we have to be comfortable with that. And the choice then that we make is, given the evidence that we have and how strong that evidence is or how weak that evidence is, and given a degree of uncertainty, do we have enough to feel comfortable making a recommendation or taking action? And some of that is the individual's shoulders to make that decision. Maybe I don't have an exact volume of conclusive data that shows without a doubt that X or Y is safe or X or Y is harmful. We have to be able to make decisions and move forward, even given uncertainty. Otherwise, we just do nothing, right? Like we're just in this paralysis mode. And at the same time, we have to recognize that vested industries, the chemical industry, the tobacco industry, et cetera, part of their procedure is to manufacture doubt. There's multiple books written on the topic of manufactured doubt. There's a 2014 documentary called Merchants of Doubt that talks about this, that there are paid consultants at these large industries that represent the chemical company or whatever, agricultural industry, whatever it is, the sugar lobby, that intentionally sow doubt. And so I think a lot of the folks that are on the side of the environmental health conversation that are being dismissive, they've just swallowed that manufactured doubt and they don't recognize it.
Popping into today's episode to let you know about our newest resource for women's health professionals, the Practitioner's Guide to Optimizing Egg Quality. This comprehensive guide breaks down the 5 key steps to improving egg quality, along with the top 5 evidence-based supplements to support egg development, mitochondrial health, and implantation potential. Head over to fertilityfriday.com/egg-quality to grab your complimentary copy today. That's fertilityfriday.com/egg-quality. Now let's go ahead and jump back into today's episode. So what you're saying is that it's not necessarily a surprise to learn this, but these organizations are specifically like paying people to go out there and say, actually, these chemicals are really safe. And now This is a movie. This is not like a scientific source, but I remember watching Erin Brockovich, right? That movie. And it was based, I don't know how loosely, so please just excuse if it's like not the most scientific, but what came to mind when you said that was that part of that movie where one of the families was like, they actually sent someone out and they did a whole seminar telling us that it was safe and how good it was for us.
Yes. But that has been repeated in countless industries. And this is also not new, right? So I'm in the middle of reading an excellent book called The Poison Squad, which has to do with Harvey Wiley, who was a chemist at the turn of the last century, late 1800s, into the 1900s. And he was instrumental in, among some other sort of events that happened, he was instrumental in the passage of the very first Food and Drugs Act of 1906. And I'm listening to this highly cited book or audiobook, but a book that's talking about all of the lengths that the chemical industry at the time, there wasn't really a pharmaceutical industry, but there were people selling what are called patent medicines. This is where the term snake oil salesman comes from, that era. The meat packing industry, all of these industries that were producing like the most toxic, adulterated food with formaldehyde in it, saturated in formaldehyde. Milk would be preserved with formaldehyde so that they can sell spoiled milk and people won't know. They would use copper chromate. And I mean, it's a fascinating book. I highly encourage people to read it. It's an easy book to listen to or interesting book to read, even though it's technical. In the health space, folks love to glamorize and sensationalize the way our grandparents ate. It was all pure. They didn't have pesticides. Girl, they had worse. The food was so bad.
Didn't they advertise DDT as an insect repellent or something?
Yeah, so DDT was used as an insect repellent. Kids were sprayed with it, powdered with it on a regular basis. They would run after
like if you ever
DDT
see those old
truck.
ads, it's like there was like a catchphrase of like rhyming it. Yeah.
So and these industries they recycle the same tactics. The tobacco industry used it very famously to manufacture doubt about the safety or the harm of cigarettes. And so that documentary that I mentioned, Merchants of Doubt, highlights that the literal same human beings that were paid by the tobacco industry to discount and manufacture doubt about the harm of cigarettes were then also hired by people in the fossil fuel industry to discount the data on climate change, like the actual same person. So like these are tactics that are utilized over and over and over again, which is why we're in this like really messy soup of discourse about nutrition, about pharmaceuticals, about environmental health, environmental chemicals, and it really muddies the water. So that's where like we have to take a data forward, I think, very data forward view on this topic. And what does the data say? And the data says these environmental chemicals, many of the ones that we are exposed to, are absolutely causing or contributing in some capacity to poor health outcomes. And the way we rectify that, first and foremost, is by regulating these chemicals in a more comprehensive way, in a way that minimizes exposure. But when we try to do that, we're up against that same industry influence. So it is like we're kind of stuck. We've been in this spot for decades.
Well, so I know before we started recording, I mean, one of the things that we were talking about was the difference between the kind of addressing toxin exposure as a personal issue versus a kind of bigger, broader problem.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I mean, I think one of the challenging aspects of that is that we want to have personal power over our
Yes.
own selves and over our own health. And I think we do to some degree. I think there's a lot of benefit to being made aware of these different products. I mean, as a female, all of the products that are made for us are full of all kinds of chemicals.
Yes.
And there's
Yes.
a lot of studies that show that if you just stop lathering that stuff all over your body, that it really does reduce your exposure in a
Yeah.
significant
Yeah.
way. And so there's a lot of value to that. But to your point, why are the chemicals allowed to be there in the first, like, right? So there's definitely more to this conversation, and we still have to go
Yeah.
outside. We still have to breathe air. We're still being exposed. So I think earlier when I was kind of pointing that dichotomy between like, I'm going to take control of my health and my exposure, I'm going to do everything I can versus just being super apathetic. It's like one of the challenges I've with clients is just sometimes for someone who hears about it might be less common now because it's like you said, it's a really big part of the general conversation. But for like, I remember working with younger women in their 20s, like women, and not saying anything negative, but like when you're in your 20s, maybe you're not actively trying to have a baby. Like you might not have been exposed to all of this information around
Right.
all of this stuff. So I remember doing these group classes, and I would have someone who really was green to this information, and
Yeah.
just like you'd see the look on her face. She would just, because if you really get into it, it's everywhere. It's like, it's not just your beauty products. It's not just those
Right.
scented plugins. It's the off-gassing of your carpet. It's the mattress.
Right.
It's as you were saying earlier, it's apparently your legging. Like it's everything,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
So I think for my listeners to this podcast, we don't really have to convince them that the science is there. I feel like they
Right.
know, you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
and this is something that I've written about. And like I said, there's an extensive chapter in the recent book. Lily wrote this whole chapter on toxins related to fertility. And so there's enough evidence, like you said, for us to know that some of these chemicals are associated with certain negative outcomes.
Yeah.
To what extent, in which all of that is a whole other conversation.
Right.
So in the work that you've done, what can we do for the person who is a little bit more type A? I want to be clean.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Like, what do I do? Right? Like, so where's that middle ground? What have you found has
Yeah.
been most helpful for your clients?
So I think just to frame it in the fertility conversation, the primary things that I think are important to prioritize. I mean, I try not to talk too much about environmental chemicals through a like condition specific lens, because all of the chemicals that are negatively impact human fertility also impact cardiovascular disease, also can impact cancer, can also impact metabolic conditions. So there's like redundancy, like so much redundancy. So because we have these single chemical can have like a dozen different endpoints, and we don't know what makes it move down one path and affect this person this way and that person that way. It might be the timing of exposure, like when are we being exposed? It might be the dose that we're being exposed to. It might be genetic susceptibilities that turn somebody down this path and somebody else down that path. I say all of that to say the primary things that I would prioritize within the context of human fertility, male and female, are endocrine disrupting chemicals. That probably tracks with what's in this chapter that you guys wrote. So endocrine disrupting chemicals primarily, and then things like heavy metals. The strongest evidence that we have in terms of environmental chemicals affecting human fertility are with things like phthalates, an endocrine disrupting class of endocrine disrupting chemicals. Phthalates is not just one chemical, it's many chemicals that are used in different places. BPA, and I would extend that out to bisphenols in general, because BPA, like phthalates, is just opposite of phthalates. BPA is one chemical in a family of chemicals like bisphenols. So phthalates are a family, bisphenols are a family, and then PFAS chemicals, that's the third one. PFAS chemicals are a large family. We don't even know how many, but it's estimated to be at least 14,000 chemicals under the PFAS umbrella, and phthalates less, and bisphenols less. And so the strongest evidence that we have are with those three classes of chemicals. And so then the task becomes, well, where do those chemicals show up? And how can I focus my time and my effort without going overboard to, as I like to say, identify and address. So let's identify where they are and then let's address them in the ways that are reasonable and accessible. So we can just go through that list of those three chemical categories and say, okay, well, where do those live? And what can we do to minimize our exposure? So phthalates, there's two different types. There's like high molecular weight phthalates and low molecular weight phthalates. So high molecular weight phthalates are what are used in plastics, so soft plastics. This is things like a shower curtain, a rubber duck, a like plastic PVC raincoat for kids, for adults, whatever. Kids' rubber boots, for example, soft plasticky materials. Sometimes even in food packaging, like squeezable ketchup bottles, etc. So those are high molecular weight phthalates in plastics. Low molecular weight phthalates are found in fragranced products. So perfume, but also makeup, and also your toilet bowl cleaner, and your shower spray, and your kitchen sink spray, and your laundry detergent, and your dryer sheets. And if you have them, scented candles, and air fresheners, and Febreze, and plugins, and reed diffusers, and incense, and the whole gamut of fragrances. And so the recommendation is twofold, is one end of the spectrum, is to minimize exposure or use of soft plastics. I like to prioritize food packaging because that is exposure that we're ingesting. And so that exposure route is likely to be more impactful than exposure that we get from like a raincoat. And I'll say maybe to that, because skin absorption of high molecular weight compounds is going to be limited to some extent. That said, materials shed chemicals for the most part. These chemicals that are used in all manner of products are not molecularly bound. They're just kind of hanging out. And so that means that those molecules can shed on their own. And where do they shed? They shed into our homes. And where do they settle? They settle in the dust in our homes. So there's been numerous studies. There was a meta-analysis of, I don't remember how many studies they looked at. I think it was 14 studies done across the US of house dust studies. Super boring topic, but to some people, I think it's really interesting. And 100% of dust samples across all of these studies contained phthalates and some other compounds. So phthalates are ubiquitous and they're in the dust in our house. So yes, they're going to shed from the raincoat, and yes, they're going to shed from the shower curtain and the rubber ducks and all that. And we may not encounter too much of that through our skin, but when they settle in our dust, then we inhale them and then we ingest them when we handle that. Anything that fell on the floor, and then you're eating popcorn on the couch and you drop something and you pick it up and you get a little dust and you don't realize it. So house dust is a meaningful source of exposure. And so what do? We clean our homes more frequently, a recommendation that no one wants to hear. I'm sorry. And there's a specific way that we do it. This is a low cost or no cost intervention, is we either increase house cleaning so that there's more frequency with the aim of capturing and removing things like dust. So not sweeping it with a broom, because that's just kicking it up and kicking it around, using a vacuum. Ideally, this is not a low-cost intervention, but is getting a vacuum with a HEPA filter. That's ideal, but any vacuuming is going to be better than no vacuuming. And then wet dusting. Wet dusting is just taking like a cotton cloth, whatever kind of cloth, getting it damp. Doesn't have to be even with cleaning solution. Just water is fine. And the idea is that we are capturing that dust, and then we can wash that material and reuse it over and over again. So I'm not recommending Swiffer. Swiffer does the same thing, but that is plastic. It's a woven plastic that will sit in a landfill for 500 years. So don't endorse using those types of products. So that's a really simple intervention, is increasing house dusting, and then hand washing. So like wash your hands regularly, even though you're in your own house and maybe you're just like making a sandwich. If you're going to go sit on the couch and eat it, wash your hands. It can actually help reduce chemicals that we're exposed to in the home. And then going back to the fragrances, is ditch those scented candles and the air fresheners and the home fragrances. Those ones are super unnecessary. If people are using them because their house smells funky otherwise, go figure out what's causing the funk and address that. Don't like cover it up with Lily of the Valley, whatever. I don't know what people are buying these days. That's a very dated, like 1970s fragrance. So sorry. But getting rid of those fragrances completely can lead to a reduction in phthalate metabolites in the body. So that's a starting place because that's an unnecessary use. Then when it comes to like your personal care products and your household cleaners, use what you have, finish it up. I'm not the type of person that says like throw everything out, OMG. The concern for exposure to all of these chemicals is not individual exposures like, oh no, I was in an elevator with somebody that had perfume on and now my clothes smell, I'm going to have cancer. That is not what we're talking about. We are talking about low levels of exposure chronically over time, over years, decades. And so the sooner that we can intervene and lower those exposures and keep them low by maintaining these behaviors, that's likely where the benefit will present. And so that's the scope of the conversation. So ditch the home fragrances, use up the personal care products and household cleaners that you have. And then when it's time to replace them, go for fragrance-free, unscented. Always look on the ingredient label. You'll see the word fragrance. Even you'll see that on unscented products. This is not a guarantee that the product contains phthalates. It is just an indication that it might. So you might see products that have some type of fragrance that's added and they say it's phthalate free. You can choose to buy that or not buy that. That's up to you. But that's the general direction that we're going with phthalates, is getting rid of as many fragrances as possible, cleaning up our house dust, and then to the degree possible, prioritizing as it pertains to like food. If you can find something that's in a glass container, like a glass tomato sauce or stewed tomatoes or whatever, over like anything that's soft and squishy, mayonnaise in a glass jar versus mayonnaise in a plastic container. It's a high-fat food. Phthalates can be pulled out by that. The other way around. Doesn't matter. Go for glass over plastic when you can, and it's not possible all the time. It's just don't stress about it, is my point. Make changes where you can, but don't stress about it. So that's sort of the conversation around phthalates. And that's a tall order in and of itself. And so that might take somebody 6 months to tackle all that. Fine, that's okay. Again, this is a long game. It takes however long it takes. And any reduction is better than no reduction. So we all do what we can. Moving on to bisphenols, BPA, BPS, BPF. I think one of the conversation points that is often used in a sort of dismissive manner about the discourse around environmental exposures is to target one specific exposure and dismiss the harm from that exposure. So for example, thermal paper cash register receipts are coated in bisphenols. Sometimes it's BPA, sometimes it's BPS, BPF. These are similar compounds that have similar health effects. A lot of times when products are marketed as BPA free, that is just marketing garbage because that product still might contain BPS or BPF, which research shows has the same types of effects. So not better. It's like a whack-a-mole. They whack one down and a couple other pop up in their place. And so what people like to do is they'll say, the amount of exposure to BPA that you get from a cash register receipt, which you do because when you touch it, if you close your eyes and touch paper and then touch a receipt, you can feel the difference. Aside from thermal paper being thinner, it's also like it's powdery feeling because it's powdered. And those are just free BPA molecules coming off. And we do absorb through our hands, not a ton, but we do. And so people are dismissive of this by saying the amount of BPA that you absorb from your cash register receipt is minuscule and doesn't have any effect. Yes, that might be true. But what if we add the BPA from the cash register receipt, plus the BPA from the canned food, plus the BPA that you're also getting from these other, you took your soup and your canned tomatoes and you put them in a plastic blender that had BPA and you blended them when they were hot and it pulled more of that BPA out. Now you've got multiple stacked exposures to BPA. Collectively, do those matter? Yeah, I would wager that they do. We also have emerging research. It's not that emerging, but there's like a field of research that's trying to examine the effect of multiple exposures at the same time. The field of exposomics, which gets its name from genomics, and the whole like, we're going to map our genome and we're going to know everything, about everyone.
Popping into today's episode with a quick question. Do you like paper charting? Today's episode is brought to you by the Fertility Awareness Mastery Charting Workbook. This is the first beautifully designed, fully customizable paper charting workbook designed with you in mind. With 3 years worth of charting pages, the Fertility Awareness Mastery Charting Workbook has you covered. If you've been looking for a solid alternative to charting apps, you'll love this charting workbook. The FAM Charting Workbook is available in both Fahrenheit and Celsius editions and is available in spiral-bound, paperback, and ebook versions. Head over to fertilityfriday.com/workbook to order your copy today. That's fertilityfriday.com/workbook. Now let's go ahead and jump back into today's episode.
And so we have exposomics, which is a field that is attempting to, from a very data-heavy perspective, assess the totality of exposures and the impact of the totality of exposures. But we study chemicals one at a time, right? We don't study them as mixtures. It's really complicated. But we have found that when we have two chemicals that have similar effects, together, the outcome of that exposure is greater than the sum of the individual exposures. So it's amplified. And so that's what I think of when somebody's like, the BPA in your receipt doesn't mean anything. And I'm like, but what is it? Yeah, on its own, it doesn't mean anything. But I don't live in a world where that's the only exposure that I get. I live in the real world. And so it is, again, this totality of exposures to endocrine disrupting chemicals, again, in particular in this conversation, that I think are the most important. So if we're looking at BPA, BPA is found in thermal receipts. It's found in some polycarbonate plastic. Polycarbonate plastic is the type of plastic that like your Cuisinart food processor bowl is made out of, and your Vitamix that you spent $450 on, whatever. That one may or may not contain BPA, but that type of plastic. It's also in things like your eyeglasses. That plastic that is in your eyeglasses is polycarbonate. Are we getting a meaningful exposure to BPA from our eyeglasses given the context of how they're being worn and interacted with? Probably not. Bisphenols are also found in canned foods. And so those compounds can leach out of the food into leach out of the can into the food, and we consume those foods, and then we can get a spike in our BPA levels. The good news about both of the classes of phthalates and bisphenols is they have very short half-lives, which means that they are actually metabolized and excreted very quickly. The half-life is about 6 hours, rough 6 to 12 hours for these compounds. That doesn't mean that in that time, they're not kind of turning on and off some lights that maybe they shouldn't have. That doesn't mean that they're not messing with things. One, and two, because we're getting multiple exposures to, say, BPA from the canned food and BPA from the receipt all day, every day, our exposure levels to these chemicals are constant, right? They're constantly present because we're adding them in faster than we can take them, than our bodies can take them out, even if they can do that quickly. And so that's where we don't need a detox. We don't need a supplement to help get rid of BPA in your body. You just need to lower what's coming in. And that's a behavior change. That's a change in the things that you buy and the way you interact with materials. So I am somebody who's, I don't want to say I'm like anti-detox, because there's certainly times and places where it's absolutely the appropriate medical intervention. But I'm not a huge fan of the like, everybody detox, take all these supplements, do all this stuff. These products make huge claims about like, we're going to get rid of your toxins out of your body. Which toxins? Which ones specifically? Heavy metals? Because the way you would get a heavy metal out wouldn't apply to a phthalate or a bisphenol. So behavior changes. So that means minimizing the consumption of canned foods. You can find BPA-free cans, but again, what are they using? Are they using BPS? Are they using BPF? It's not a perfect, we're not aiming for perfect. We're just trying to do what we can. So that means not handling thermal receipts too much. Don't go to the grocery store with your little kid in the front of the cart and hand them the cash register receipt so they can put it in their mouths and crinkle it up in their hands as you are unloading the groceries into the trunk of your car. Like, not recommended. The bigger impact is going to be for people who work as cashiers or who work at a restaurant that are handling receipts all day, every day. That's a greater impact. So if you can, in those jobs, wear gloves. If you can't wear gloves, wear what are called finger cots, which fingers that you would normally handle. So like your middle finger, your pointer finger, and your thumb, those are the fingers that you would normally use to accept and give receipts. Finger cots are like little condoms for your fingertips, for anybody who's like, what did she say? So that's fun. You can walk around with a little container of finger condoms. So those are the interventions. Minimize canned foods, minimize plastic. I have a plastic Cuisinart blender, I have a plastic Vitamix, and I still use them. The general rule of thumb is do not put hot foods in them. Heat can increase leaching. Do not grind really hard foods. I know you can, but I don't recommend it because you are abrading the surface of the interior of those plastics, which is also going to increase leaching and migration of those chemicals. Don't put them in the dishwasher. The dishwashing detergent is quite caustic, so it can damage those plastics. If you put plastics in the dishwasher enough, they get foggy, and that's because you're literally like abrading the surface of that plastic. And then just in general, minimizing plastic use across the board in your kitchen. That's not necessarily a fertility related thing. Again, this is just a general recommendation. And then the last one is PFAS. And this one's really hard. Not going to pussyfoot around it. Avoiding PFAS is really difficult because PFAS are ubiquitous in society. PFAS are these forever chemicals, stands for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, PFAS. And they are used in every sector of society: military, medicine, food, textiles, automobiles, weapons, literally every sector, cookware. And so the task becomes avoid what's avoidable. That's it, or reduce what's avoidable. And there's plenty that's not avoidable. And so what that means in our day-to-day life is in the realm of cosmetics, we do not wear or buy long-wearing lipstick or waterproof mascara because those products likely contain PFAS chemicals. Anything that's fluoro in an ingredient is an indication that you likely have a PFAS chemistry in there. So long-wear lipstick, not recommended. Waterproof mascara, also not recommended, but they can sneak into other products as well. In terms of, say, textiles, this is, again, I'm telling you where they are with the full knowledge that like not everyone's going to be able to do something about this stuff. So again, it's information. It's not intended to freak anyone out. But like couches, upholstered furniture, those fabrics are often treated with stain-resistant chemicals. Anything Scotchgard-esque, those are PFAS chemicals. So don't intentionally waterproof textiles that you have with any spray that you would be spraying on yourself. This also is, that, I don't know what it's called. It's called Rain-X. The stuff you put on your car windshield so that the water beads off, very likely PFAS chemistry that is doing that. So PFAS chemicals add oil resistance and water resistance to products. That also means that they're in cookware. So non-stick cookware has PFAS chemicals. The more scratched that cookware is, the more those molecules of PFAS are releasing into the food that you're eating. So if you have non-stick, time to get rid of them, throw them out. I don't even recommend donating them because then somebody's going to get it in a thrift store or whatever, and then you're just passing the buck to someone else. So unfortunately, this is just throw it out. Replacing cookware doesn't have to be expensive. Sure, if somebody wants to go out and buy like titanium, stainless steel, really expensive cookware, go for it. But the basics are stainless steel, cast iron, enameled cast iron, glass, carbon steel, which is like cast iron, just very thin and light. So those can be really inexpensive. So this is, I'm very conscious of not positioning these solutions as like, here's a $500 red light device or sauna that you have to buy, or $6,000 Wim Hof ice dunk biohacking situation. We're really just looking for practical, accessible solutions. So you can look up your water quality report to see whether or not your water utility is monitoring for PFAS in the water. We did have some regulations that were brand new at the end of the last presidential term. We had new regulations to regulate 6 PFAS chemicals. There are 14,000. So the 6 that we have the most data on, we don't know. Some of those chemicals we don't know anything about, so we can't test for them. And those regulations just got a pause or got thrown out under the Trump administration. So we don't know if those regulations are actually going to be enacted. It was a really wonderful thing to celebrate for those of us that know about PFAS chemistry and the health harms. And so it was snatched away from us as a protective public health measure, along with many other things, unfortunately. If you have PFAS in your water, I think that there are other places where you can, databases that you can find this out. If you don't know and you can't find it out, you can test for it. It can be expensive, but consumer testing is available. TapScore is the company that I recommend. If you do have PFAS in your water, I recommend filtering it. We're not aiming to buy plastic water bottles. That's not it. We're going to filter our drinking water, and you're going to be looking at like a multi-stage under sink filter that's got like multiple canisters of filtration media. That's what's been proven to be the most effective. That and reverse osmosis filtration, which might be overkill for a lot of people. Like your Brita water filter is not going to do anything to remove PFAS. It can be a little bit tricky to remove. And we just do the best that we can. PFAS are, like I said, they are ubiquitous. And so we do what we can. We don't have data yet as to whether or not these interventions are truly impactful. The most impactful way to reduce PFAS levels in the body is to donate blood and plasma. But that's not a reasonable recommendation, especially when that blood and plasma just gets moved into the donation stream. So we are literally just passing on PFAS to whoever gets that blood or plasma. It is not a sustainable solution, but it is a evidence-based one. So that's kind of, it's a lot. I know I just spoke for like a good 10, 15 minutes just then, but that's kind of where we spend our time, not obsessively, but just like, hey, my shampoo's running out. What can I find that is fragrance free? And maybe that requires a little bit of emotional negotiation because we love our scents. Like we love our laundry detergents and our dryer sheets and all that. And so we have to kind of pick and choose. What do we want to do and what do we not want to do? But those are big needle movers. So.
Mm-hmm. You know, I really appreciate you going through the different categories and what we can do. I mean, obviously it is a lot, but you know that whenever you, like whoever clicks on this, like toxins conversation, like we know that it's going to be a big kind of wake up call. And of course, there were some of the things that you mentioned in there that I could improve on a little bit. Like I've got it pretty dialed in, but there's always other things that you could be doing to improve. And what I really liked about what you said was that, you know, you positioned it as like the goal is reduction. And I think that that's key. And somewhere in there, you were talking about how our bodies can get some of these chemicals out relatively quickly. And so it's really not about that one time that you touch the receipt or whatever. It's really about looking at the day-to-day, your repeated exposures, and where are those opportunities to reduce your chronic exposure.
Yeah.
And I feel like the way you framed it is really, really helpful. It's very practical. It's obviously evidence-based. And it really shows us what we're actually dealing with. Like it's a pretty big, like tiger to slay or whatever you want to call it.
Yes.
But at least you know what you're dealing with and then proper way to go about it. Because if you don't know that, then I feel like you'll be stressing about the wrong thing. And I feel like that might be a big part of your message.
Yes. Like I said, everybody's at a different place. Everybody has a different budget. Everybody has a different like mental bandwidth to even spend 10 minutes thinking about this. And so this is where like perfect is the enemy of good. That applies to 1,000 different things. And so we just want to get to good. Like we do not want to try for perfect. In my life, I swapped out my conventional mattress for an organic mattress, but it took me like 7 or 8 years to do that because that was a really big ticket item. Those are expensive. And so I had to save for that. And it was like when I did have extra money, that wasn't the priority. And so I didn't like lie in my conventional mattress every night and being like, oh no, I'm slowly dying. Like, that's not the vibe, right? Like, we're just trying to make practical changes, modifications to our daily lives in ways that support minimizing exposure, but that don't add stress. Because stress is also toxic, if we want to use it in that way, because stress contributes to 80% of chronic illness. And we are all stressed. It is 2025. Anybody who's like, I'm not stressed, I'm like, you're either lying or you're not paying attention to anything. And so we all have a stress burden. And if worrying about toxic exposures is adding to that burden, it's time to take a step back and say, what's a very small thing that I can do? And I'm going to forget the rest and I'm just going to move forward. And we do what we can. And I want to stress that, again, we're not trying to, and we shouldn't be fearful of exposures to things that we know or we suspect might have harmful chemicals. This is where the like organic food, conventional food conversation comes in. I support a consumption of organic food, as do many of the top researchers in the field of environmental health. And a lot of the positioning around organic food, and I was guilty of doing this in the early years that I was having this conversation, is it's using that always never language, or fear mongering to the point where people are like, well, if I can't buy organic raspberries, I'm just not going to eat raspberries. And that's not it either, because we have plenty of evidence that the regular consumption of nutrient-dense fruits and vegetables, regardless of whether how they were grown, has net positive benefit on like every single health outcome metric. 97% of men and 90% of women in this country don't eat enough fiber. If we just solved that problem, raspberries, by the way, have like the highest amount of fiber of like, I think any fruit, coincidentally. If we just got solved that problem, rates of chronic disease would go down, right? So there are really big needle movers in the like public health conversation, and that's not smoking, eating your fruits and vegetables, moving your body. Like those are the fundamentals. Beyond that, for folks that are already doing that and they're still having some kind of health issues, that's when you can slide more into the minutia and say like, well, maybe I need to be eating a little bit more of these foods and less of this other food. And maybe I do need to be cleaning up my environment more. And so I think that the more balanced and pragmatic way that we can view this conversation while still taking some action, we're all going to benefit from that. And we just are not going to benefit if we are stressing out and freaking out about every exposure.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I couldn't agree more. I really like how you kind of make sure to get into the nuance of this topic, because it can be overwhelming. It is overwhelming, right? Like this is a really overwhelming topic if you actually sit down and think about it. So it's really important that we ground it in real evidence-backed information, strategies that are actually going to make a difference, and finding that common ground so that you're not basing what you're doing on the like the worst case scenario in your head. You know what I mean? Like,
and the social media hype, because that the
watch
sensational, like watch your feed 100%, like the sensation
or don't,
get off of it entirely. Like here's the thing, social media currency is clicks and engagement. That's where rage bait content comes in, where people are posting stuff like with the intention of like getting you pissed off so that you're going to be a keyboard warrior and click, click, click away in their comment section, because that boosts their engagement. And if they monetize their account or if they sell products, that gets more eyeballs on them. And so they don't often care that they're actually hurting the conversation. They might actually know that in some cases. But this overly sensationalized presentation of the toxic conversation is something that is really upsetting to me, because it is a reasonable person would look at that level of obsession and like overblown science and go, that's crazy. And therefore, by association, anything that is discussed on the topic that is adjacent to that or parallel to that, i.e. toxins, is also absurd. And I'm just going to be dismissive of the whole thing. And so it really damages the very legitimate, very long running massive pile of evidence and dismisses the work of the thousands and thousands of environmental health researchers and scientists because you've got some clown on the internet telling you that your yoga pants are going to give you cancer. No. And so I really like for my students as health professionals, this is something that I'm trying to teach and impart at every level of like, we don't do that because that hurts the conversation. It unnecessarily scares and overwhelms people. And then one of the other reactions, aside from the people that are like, oh no, I have to do everything and I have anxiety and I'm overwhelmed, are the people who are just completely dismissive because the clown who's doing it is a clown, right? So this is the landscape of this discourse on social media is really disturbing to me.
Mm-hmm. I mean, on the one hand, I'm always like the weird optimist in the sidelines, like the annoying one that's like, but so I would say potentially they say if someone's like all news is no, I'm trying to think of a phrase where they talk about like whether or not they're talking about you in a good way or a bad way, at least they're talking about you.
No, yeah, so like no publicity is bad.
Yeah,
no, bad publicity
so
is still good publicity.
Yeah. I mean, I think that there's a lot of value in the fact that people are talking about it, and having the conversation around how to talk about it is probably better than not having the conversation about it. So I feel like at least we're here, and at least a lot of people are now aware of it, but I understand your perspective, given that this is like, right? Like this is, you're in it. Like you're so
I'm in it. I'm fully in it. Yeah.
It's so frustrating to have. I think one of the challenges when you're in it, because I'm not in the toxin conversation to the degree that you are. I'm in like the fertility awareness conversation.
Sure.
So like when I'm in there, there's so much nuance that I want to be part of the conversation. Yes. The average person just is very black and white because they're not in it. They don't know all the different complexities. So I'm really happy that we were able to go through this. I feel like I learned so much. I'm so excited to share this conversation. And I know that my audience is really going to appreciate it. Like I said, my audience doesn't need any convincing that the toxins are there. And the practical solutions that you shared are amazing and very grounded. And I know that they're going to appreciate this so much.
Good.
So I would love to invite you to share a little bit about you, where the listeners can go to learn about you, learn about your work. You mentioned your work with other practitioners. Share that as well. And anything exciting that you have on the horizon.
Cool. So yeah, for folks that just want some kind of everybody accessible information, they can go to Instagram. I'm there at Environmental Toxins Nerd. There's plenty of content in the feed to scroll through and learn little snippets of education and action. And if you happen to be a health professional of any type, you can just go to my website, which is my name, laraadler.com, and check out the courses that I have there for health professionals of all types. And I think I shared this before, I'm in the middle of rewriting my big course. And so that's like a 6-month endeavor that I'm very excited about because it is pushing a lot more of this nuance and sort of delicate nature of this conversation so that health professionals have a solid information base to be able to then share this with their audience. So that's it for now.
Love, love, love it. Well, for anyone who's listening on the go, we will make sure to link all of those places to our show notes page. And Lara, I just want to thank you so much for being here. This has been such a great and informative conversation. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode and you're wanting to share it with a friend or you're wanting to grab any of the links that we talked about, head over to fertilityfriday.com/586. I hope that you enjoyed today's episode with Lara. I feel like we covered so much ground. I mean, there was so much that we talked about today. Lara took some time to really go into this issue and provide a lot of context. And I mean, I do think that this audience is well-versed in the issue regarding toxins. So I do feel like we get it. We know, first of all, that there is a connection between toxins and a variety of different health issues. That's certainly not something that we need to be convinced of. And we also know that there is something that we can do about it, especially for those of you who use menstrual cycle charting, whether you use it personally or whether you use it with clients. That is one of the ways that we can really gain insight into what's happening. So it's not always super obvious initially, but if you are working with a client who is kind of heavily exposed to certain toxins and does start to make different changes, learns a little bit more about the different sources of toxin exposure and starts to clean up their beauty routine and clean up their household cleaning products, and then start to kind of move towards more natural alternatives in a variety of different areas. Often we see certain things shift on the cycle. We start to see hormones normalize a little bit. And how do we tell if hormones are normalizing? Well, we look at the menstrual parameters. We look at the different aspects of the menstrual cycle on the chart. We also look at symptoms. And so one of the great things about charting is that we can actually see some of these tangible results. So I think another really important focus was practical strategies. It can be a little bit intimidating to hear about all these things that we can do, because I'm sure that at least most of us, I know even myself included, there were certain things that Lara mentioned that I've done quite a bit towards this aim, but there's certain things that she mentioned that I haven't necessarily done yet. So I think one way to look at it is also like a process instead of just a destination, a process that unfolds over time. So you kind of start with the lowest hanging fruit. Like if you're using scented products, you kind of finish those. You don't have to go and like throw them all out, but you kind of work through those products. And then as you replace different products, replacing them with non-scented alternatives that are more on the clean side, and then doing a bit of due diligence as you go about this journey to ensure that the products and brands that you're using are free from these chemicals and those kinds of things. But I think Lara and I both hinted at the fact that, I mean, I know for myself, it wasn't this overnight thing where when I learned of all this, all of a sudden I threw out everything I had and the next day was using all clean products. And I started my journey on this road decades ago when there wasn't even a good selection of natural care products. I was starting my journey when there wasn't entire aisles full of alternative products. There wasn't entire stores full of all of these different products. And back then, some of the products didn't even work. So you'd have these like so-called natural products, but they didn't work properly. And it was still difficult to clean. So I do think that there's a lot of positives. I mean, one of the negatives is that there's probably more chemicals out there now because every year corporations come out with thousands of new chemical formulations. But on the bright side, there's a lot more alternatives now for those of us who are wanting to improve our routines. You know, if you're wanting toxin-free menstrual products, if you're wanting toxin-free cleaning supplies, there's a lot of options now. And even regular brands will sell products that are free of dyes and fragrance. So you don't have to search as hard anymore to find products. It's still a challenge. I'm not saying it's not a challenge, but we can look at the bright side and recognize that there's a whole industry of clean products now. And so it's typically easier to find things that are non-toxic and actually still work. So with that said, like I said, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If it resonated with you, if you can think of someone who would really love this information, feel free to share. So the share link again, fertilityfriday.com/586. With that said, I hope you have a wonderful weekend, whenever you're tuning into the show. And of course, as always, until next time, be well and happy charting. If you're loving the podcast and you're ready to apply fertility awareness strategies in your women's health practice, then I know you'll love our Fertility Awareness Mastery Mentorship. It's a 9-month immersive experience that will completely transform the way you work with clients, allowing you to not only teach fertility awareness, but to use the menstrual cycle as a vital sign and diagnostic tool in your women's health practice. Our next class starts in January 2026, so there's still time to reserve your spot. There's no other program like this offered anywhere. Transform your practice in 9 months. Head over to fertilityfriday.com/famlive to apply now. That's fertilityfriday.com/FAMMLIVE.